So now that we talked about the motivation for requirements engineering and why you should care, and also some basics of requirements engineering, now let's move forward to the requirements engineering process. What is it that we're going to spend most of our time on in this lecture series? You will get back to this figure probably 10, 20, 30 times throughout this course, and it's one of the most crucial pieces of information that you should take away from here, because it gives you the structure of the actual process that each and every requirements engineering process or task project should go through. So we start on the left side with the requirements analysis that is divided into elicitation, negotiation, often in combination with analysis, documentation, and validation. Once you have all the requirements, then you do requirements management, which covers change management and tracing. And while we're going to do like explicit lectures for each of those subcategories and tasks, let's have a quick introductory look into those. What do they actually mean? And we're going to start on the left side of the figure, meaning we're going to look into elicitation. What does that entail? So you usually start the elicitation process at the start of your project. The content is roughly known, like okay, you're supposed to build a website or the software that controls the brakes of a vehicle. And your tasks is to first identify the stakeholders, like who is relevant for this, who should we talk to, who should we incorporate in the process. Identification of additional sources of requirements. That could be, for example, an existing system. So if you are supposed to create a new website for an already existing company, maybe they have one. Maybe they can tell you what they are not happy with, what they would like to have for the new one. Those are like good discussion starters. So there might be a physical product or thing that you can look at and play around with. And there could also be just legacy software that needs to be updated or rewritten. And if you're lucky, a requirements document for those exists, so you could use them. And then you're also supposed to gather raw new requirements or raw requirements in general. So you need something to get started that needs to be refined later on, but you have something that it covers the core of the requirements. So this is what elicitation is mostly about. How can you do this? We're going to look at various elicitation techniques that you can apply in different scenarios, but their approach is usually quite similar. There's in most projects a visit to the customer involved. You usually interview them and make sure that you do not do hundreds of interviews and only involve a few people in this process. And you document important names that are documents and important names are retrieved in this part of the elicitation phase. Then you evaluate the results and determine open questions, and you could ask targeted questions in interviews that will solve specific unclear requirements that you want to elicit or can already foresee. Customers or other stakeholders are asked and possibly in forms of workshops, but as I said, we'll go into the details of those specific techniques. Long story short, elicitation is about figuring out what they want, and then once you have the core, moving on from there. So next is the analysis and negotiation, often also referred to just as negotiation. You start that process once you have illicit requirements, and then you start the identification of the concrete requirements from those. That entails also structuring requirements, meaning identifying relationships between them, also classifying requirements. We'll talk about functional, non-functional requirements, constraints later on. Merging of similar requirements, because maybe you did some interviews or workshop where people came up with very, very similar ways of phrasing the same requirement. So you just merge them together if this is applicable. You can also start grouping requirements based on relationships or maybe based on functionalities. They could all belong to the user interface or to the database or some other meaningful way of structuring them. Next is then the refinement of the requirements. So you have a raw requirement or a slightly too vague requirement. Make it as explicit as necessary so that someone can implement that requirement. For each requirement, you should also identify eventual dependencies that you need to be aware of. Detecting inconsistencies is also a problem. So earlier we talked about this problem of getting level 2 access where you need to have level 2 access to request level 2 access, which was a problem. You have to not only detect those inconsistencies, but also resolve them before starting the implementation process. And depending on the project, you might also need to prioritize your requirements, because usually your customers want the one thing, which is great, but the budget that they have to get this thing they want usually doesn't really match. So they have to decide what is a must-have requirement and what is optional. And budget doesn't only have to be like from a financial perspective. It could also be a time constraint, or just like how much work power do you have to do that, and various other constraints that might be applicable. How do you do this? You study records of meetings with your customers that you might have written down during workshops or while interviewing them. If there are things unclear, you ask questions if needed. So you're going back to elicitation if you notice that something is missing. You resolve ambiguities, preferably offline, so that you don't have to go there all the time with a phone call. If you notice any contradictions, then we go straight to negotiations, so trying to figure out how can we resolve those contradictions, usually among different stakeholders. And in parallel, writing the specification, which then leads you to the next part that we're going to talk about in a few seconds. And then distribution of those initial specifications that you usually call a draft to these relevant stakeholders, so that they can have a look at this and say, yep, that seems to make sense, or half of it is missing. And workshops with all important people are often also part of this negotiation phase. Stakeholders, project managers, software architects, or any other people who might be relevant. Presentation of the obtained requirements is going to be your task as the requirements engineer. You could present them by giving them the draft or the slides of the draft of the requirements document. You could also try to put it in slides, or if it's, for example, a website, you could create mock-ups. That is highly individual depending on the project. And you need to use those presentations also to prioritize the requirements and also make them more concrete if necessary. Usually you do this with at least 2 people, because one of you has to do intensive record keeping. Of course, you could also just run like an audio thing so that you can listen to it again, but usually it makes more sense if someone is writing in parallel. Once you've done this, or you already did this slightly in parallel with writing the first draft, we're moving to the documentation phase. It does exactly what it promises in the name. You have to write down everything. So you specify the requirements through various documentation techniques that we will discuss. You document intermediate results and assumptions. You document reasonings for requirements, like how did we get there, and assignments of attributes to requirements. How do you do this? Using writings driven by employees, usually some iterative and often incremental process. You have multiple drafts. You have a lot of copy and paste between those drafts, and you will have different ways of documenting things. So some requirements can be nicely documented in natural language using text. Others might benefit from a more model-based approach, so use cases, UML, and other things. Anand will provide you explicit lectures just on those topics. And at the end, you should have something that is relatively close to your final document. But the documentation is a very, very iterative process. Once you have this complete document, you go to validation. The task is to validate the content of the specification document. If possible, do a formal verification of the documents. That's usually not the case, but if you can do that, verification and validation against previously existing documents makes a lot of sense. So if you have a legacy system, if there is something that you can use, do that. But also not only against existing documents, but also comparing it to the customer wishes. So is this what they actually are looking for? Is this what they should put in the contract when starting or before starting the process or the project? Once again, what's the approach? How do you do it? Documents are reviewed by experienced employees from the customer in best case. Often less experienced people are involved in writing the requirements, and then the senior employees look into, okay, is this really what we need and want, because they just have more experience. You should also check for formal guidelines through some templates, and we will explain and provide you specific templates for requirements documents. So we'll also get something you can take away here. And another approach is checking if the customer's wishes are met by the document. And if it's possible, you could also think about producing a prototype, a mock-up, something they can touch and see. But as we already discussed, that is not always the case. This now concludes the requirements analysis part. Now we have all our requirements done and ready. We could actually start, and we're going to start the project. But even while we're doing this, we need to take care of our requirements and manage them. What could or might need to be managed are, for example, changing requirements. We just made the example of the changing tax rate that could happen throughout the life cycle of an existing product. So someone has to sit down and record the changes in the requirement that previously specified the tax rate. So it needs to be accounted for. That can maybe change again and again, so versioning of those requirements makes sense. And it also makes sense to properly organize them and then subsequently propagate those information to the relevant people. So not just to the developer who's changing a number, but also to users, for example, so that they are aware that in this new version of your software, the adapted or changed tax rate is accounted for. How do you do this? There are various approaches that we're going to discuss for change management. No matter if you're going to rely on a requirements engineering tool that has built-in change management capabilities or no, it's going to be a tedious process. Obviously, with the tool, it's slightly less or slightly more comfortable than doing it on paper and manually, but nevertheless, it's quite a lot of work and very tedious. You have to make informed and competent decisions about the change request, like how do you handle it, what does a change request process look like. You need something like a control board to make the decisions. So it takes a lot of time. And then finally, tracing, also being part of the requirements management process, where you have the task of recording assumptions, record decisions, and record which assumptions lead to which decisions and how the requirements were influenced by those. Write all of it down. Requirements engineering is in general a very note-heavy activity. You write everything down. How do you do this? You can once again use requirements engineering tools to be super effective, depending on the size of your customers and what kind of projects you do. You most of the time don't have a special tool. If you have, you probably need it because you have reached a certain size of project complexity. If you do manual tracing, it's once again similar to change management, a lot of work, requires searching in documents and protocols for certain pieces of information that you need to trace the origins of the requirements. For example, in meeting X, Y, Z, certain person said that we should do, and then we decided to do that, and then in the next meeting we reverse this decision and you get an idea of what kind of mess you're looking into. But this is still relevant because if you don't follow all those steps, you might find yourself after 5 iterations going back to something that you have already discussed months ago. And those are the relevant components of the requirements engineering process. And in the subsequent lectures, we're now going to have a look at each of them in very much detail. And once you learn them by heart, you're going to be a requirements engineer. So to summarize our first lecture on requirements engineering, what did we learn today? So first of all, we talked about the motivation, the need for requirements engineering. Why do we have to go through this painful process? Then second of all, we talked about the foundations of requirements engineering. What is software? What are requirements? What different kinds of requirement exist? What are stakeholders and so forth? And then in the third part, we also looked at the actual process itself and talked about the different phases of a requirements engineering process. In general, I can also say that system analysis in the context of requirements is a quite challenging and complex task, especially for complex projects that need to be implemented. The requirements are the foundation of our projects. Without a good requirement, projects are in trouble. We talked about the study and the survey results that we showed you earlier. Bad requirements, missing requirements, or problem with the requirements engineering process are one of the main reasons why projects fail. Finally, requirements engineering is more than just getting the requirements and writing them down. The task includes illustration, documentation, but also the validation of requirements, the change management, and the tracing of requirements. So it's much more than just figuring out what someone wants.